Welcome to this third session. How can you and I support survivors? NPM stands with all victims and survivors of abuse. Please note that this session will include conversations about abuse and abuse of power. This could be triggering for some. We encourage you to reach out to Into Account for additional support or to continue the conversation. We will provide contact information for Into Account at the end of our conversation today. My name is Jennifer Klug, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Pastoral Musicians. I am joined today by our Deputy Director, Berta Sabrio. It is our pleasure to spend some time today with Dr. Stephanie Krabel and Jay Yoder. Stephanie is the Executive Director and co-founder of Into Account. She is a scholar and advocate who specializes in social change movements, trauma, and institutional violence. Jay is the other co-founder of Into Account. They also serve as Director of Operations and is a sexual violence advocate who has taught workshops on consent, working with trauma survivors, and self-defense. Into Account provides support for survivors and allies seeking justice, accountability, and recovery in Christian contexts. We are so happy to have both of you here with us to discuss these very sensitive yet important topics. Could one of you tell us a little bit more about the mission of Into Account and how it came to be?
Sure. Stephanie and I met during Stephanie's research into justice movements, particularly in a Mennonite context, but in Christian contexts. And I'll probably let her talk a little more about that. But we connected and we started, I've been doing sexual violence advocacy for quite a while, and we started doing it in Mennonite contexts. And we worked with a kind of volunteer grassroots network of people doing it. We got some good training from Survivors Network of People Abused by Priests, so shout out to them. And then we decided we wanted to do it in a more formal way. I have a nonprofit background, and so we wanted to provide more structured services for survivors, and we came together. We think it's kind of a revolutionary way to approach advocacy. Generally, the advocacy services that are out there in a formal way are geographic, so you just have to pick someone who's near you. They may or may not have expertise in your culture. And we wanted to provide very specific services for people who experience violence in Christian contexts, because we understand what's operating in those contexts and the spiritual component that can be there that's not there, necessarily in other contexts. And so that's kind of how Into Account came to be in our specialized role in survivor advocacy. Is there anything you wanted to add, Stephanie?
Yeah, just that we are totally survivor-centric in our organizational model. So our services are always free for survivors, and we prioritize survivors in, how we allot our time. We do a little bit of consulting. We will always offer an hour of free consulting to anybody in a pastoral or institutional position, but the bulk of our income is through donations, and the bulk of our work is direct work with survivors.
Thank you. We have talked about this in our other sessions, but for those who might not yet viewed those, could we take a few moments and discuss why abuse is so often unreported and why legal recourse is rarely pursued?
That's a really great question. A lot of times survivors themselves take a while to recognize what is happening or what has happened to them as abuse or as violence. We'll talk probably a little more about this. Maybe you've heard about it if you've listened to the other sessions, but grooming is a really slow, insidious process. Or it can be quick, but it's always insidious. And it kind of is built to make people feel a little bit responsible for their own abuse. So there's this process that survivors have to go through of grappling with wait a minute, I don't think what happened was okay. Something felt wrong about that to me. It might take hours, it might take days, it might take years to grapple with someone I thought I trusted, because it's almost always an acquaintance or someone knows, turns out to have been an abuser. I experienced abuse. So first, a survivor has to come to that conclusion to be anywhere close to being able to report. And then when a survivor takes time to understand what happened to them, they know it might take someone else time too, or someone else might disbelieve them. So they might be worried about belief. They might be worried about if there's a power difference, someone believing them versus someone believing someone who has a lot of power and respect. So reporting is just very complicated. You know, we see a lot of examples of people responding badly to reporting. And every time we see one of those publicly, a survivor is taking that in, you know, and wondering, is that how people would respond to me? So, you know, and those aren't the only factors, but those are some of the factors that go into low reporting rates. For legal recourse, legal systems too, we see those responses publicly, and they are often not good. Survivors take that in, wonder if police will believe them, wonder if a lawyer will care. In addition, what we know, just having worked in the field, is that conviction rates are incredibly low. And if you back that up, the rates of number of cases that even get taken to the prosecutor, pretty low. And if you back that up, you know, cases where police take a report and consider it to be a valid report to even consider passing on to the prosecutor, also low. So at every step of the process, people are being eliminated out, even if they have reported and were hoping to pursue legal recourse. So it's just a very complicated and painful process that survivors may or may not believe will even help them. And in our experience, it is not infrequent that even when people try, it doesn't help them. And again, I don't know if you have anything to add, Stephanie.
I mean, I would just add that, you know, given everything that you've said, people need, in general, I think, are a little bit beholden to this impression that the way that they can assess whether an allegation of sexual violence is true or not is whether it is legitimized by the justice system. And you just have to let go of that, because the vast majority of sexual violence allegations are true. We know this from extensive studies. And the vast majority also are not ever going to receive anything approaching legal justice. So I really, you know, hand in hand with recognizing all of the obstacles to legal justice, I think it's also very important to move away from criminality as our framework for understanding the severity of sexual violence, because there are many things that are incredibly damaging that will almost never result in conviction, you know, or even generally reporting that's taken seriously. So it's, you need to take a conceptual shift once you take in that knowledge. I don't know that the solution is okay, well, if we can just convince survivors to report to the police more, then we can solve all this, because the problem is also with the justice system itself.
Yeah. Stephanie, to build on that last part of your answer, who can a survivor speak with, and what kind of action could they expect after they report? And that can be if the survivor chooses to report into account, or perhaps through another means of reporting.
Well, I think that with survivors, you know, if you want to tell somebody, I think most survivors choose to tell people who they trust. Sometimes that trust is validated, and sometimes they learn that trust was misplaced. But in general, it's a very good strategy. Yes, you know, if the first person that you confide in is your sister or your best friend or your mother or somebody in your church who you really trust, there's probably a next step too, where you figure out who to report that has the kind of expertise that can help you decide what to do next. But, just speaking directly to survivors, telling the first person you think of who you know will believe you is a very good strategy, because you need to have people in your corner. Like, you can't do it by yourself. Into account, we try to make it as easy as possible. And we have a reporting form on our website that survivors can fill out. And, it's a form that gives people a lot of freedom to enter into the process of disclosing in whatever way feels most comfortable. I mean, you do have to write stuff down, and just getting to that point is kind of a barrier to get over. But you can write it down, give us enough contact information that we can contact you, and then what would happen if you reported into account basically is we would ask you, would you like to have a Zoom conversation or a phone conversation? We can just do it over email if you want. Like, sort of what I usually go for a live conversation if possible, because it's easier for me to take in the kind of information that I'm getting in one of those initial intake calls. But in general, I want survivors to communicate with me or with our other advocates in whatever medium feels most comfortable to them to start with. And from there, we figure out what they want to do next. But the key is that nothing happens without them knowing. Nothing happens without them consenting to it. The survivor is in the driver's seat. So that's what I think should happen. And that's what we strive to do to the best of our ability. Jay, you want to fill in anything?
Sure. Yeah, so as to who survivors can report to, I agree with everything Stephanie said, and I'd add, it depends what point in the process someone is. So, like Stephanie said, if it's deciding who the first person is to tell, yes, I agree that if there is someone in your life who you think will trust and believe you and stand with you, that's a great first person to report to. If you're at a point where some people in your life know, and you're looking for healing or help processing it, looking for a specific trauma therapist is a really good idea. Not every therapist has expertise in trauma, so I'd look for someone with real trauma expertise. If you're at a point where you would like to hold them accountable in some way, or you want to help, a lot of survivors aren't motivated even by, I want this person to have consequences. A lot of survivors are motivated by, I want to stop this from happening to anyone else, which is where accountability then comes in naturally, because we're trying to stop someone from having access to be able to do it again. So if you're at the point where you're like, I really want to stop this person from doing this to anyone else, then an advocate is a really good fit, and especially if you can find an advocate that's an expert in your context, because they can help you, we, including us, can help you go to the police if you want to try for legal accountability, which I'm someone who is also a survivor. I did try legal accountability. It didn't work out for me, but I'm glad I tried it, so I know I did everything I could. So we understand some people want to try that. We're just very realistic with folks. If they tell us they want to try that we don't see a lot of success, but we will support you, and we understand why you want to do that. And we can also help. A lot of the work that we've done is to try and imagine other ways of preventing, as much as we can, future acts of violence by these folks who target people, by looking at other ways we can hold them accountable. And that's where we think about the trifecta of things that sort of give someone the ability to perpetrate over and over again. And those are generally that they have some sort of access to a particular population they like to target. So, you know, youth groups, or, you know, if they like to target adults, it might be choir directors, or providing direct services to adults in some way. So there's some sort of access to people they like to target. There's some sort of power over those folks usually. And then they often have the good regard of the local community, the trust of the community. So if someone's at the point where they want to prevent someone and they've tried the legal system and it doesn't work, or they're not interested in the legal system because they know it probably won't work, then we start to look at ways that we can chip away at people's access, their power over folks that they're targeting, and we ask the community to remove that trust that they've put in that person. And that's the way that we've found, those are our sort of accountability tenets of how we try to, you know, a lot of people focus on changing a perpetrator's mind, and that's someone else's work, it's not ours. But if someone can change someone who targets folks to get them not to target folks anymore, please, I'd love to see it. And that's what I deeply desire. But what we work on is, let's remove the access they have, let's remove the power they have, and let's take away that trust we put in them not to do this. And that will at least reduce how much they're able to engage in that. So that was a long answer to, you know, who can a survivor report to, but there are lots of options depending on what you're looking for. And part of the role of good advocates is to just listen, take that report, and help them assess. What are you looking for? Healing, recovery, accountability, prevention, all of those things, and then make some selections of what to do next.
Yeah, those are great answers, and it leads me into this next area that I'd like to talk about a little bit. So when somebody does hear about abuse, either from the victim or maybe perhaps from someone else who shares that information, and they doubt the validity of the report for whatever reason. I think in some cases it's because they feel duped by this person that they trusted. They begin to doubt their own judgment. This is a person that they looked up to, or they trusted, or might have shared secrets with, might be in a position of vulnerability with them. So this is my question. How do we speak to those non-believers? Those people that either just can't wrap their head around it or might have something to lose on their own. Those that think this kind of attention might have been encouraged or invited. What do we say to them? How do we convert them? Or can we?
Yeah.
That's a great, yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. That's a great question too. To the very last question, can we? Maybe not everyone, but some folks, yeah, I think so. And I think the first thing I would say, if I was talking directly to someone who's just having trouble believing, is that response is completely normal and natural and understandable. Survivors even have it as it's happening to a survivor. A survivor will often freeze partially because their brain is saying, no, this is not happening. This person that I trusted is not doing this. I am misinterpreting this. You know, this can't be happening, because it's a huge shift to make, to shift from trusting someone with maybe mentorship, maybe spiritual care, maybe just close, emotional, intimate trust and partnership and relationship, to shifting all the way to, oh, this person is a physical, bodily, you know, threat to my body and my psychological well-being. And, you know, this is a predator, because that's a big word, you know, for us in our cultures and societies. So, oh, trusted person, mentor, coach, priest, you know, spiritual advisor, best friend, boyfriend, cousin, whatever. Nope, predator. That's a huge shift to make. even for the survivor. So if you're having trouble believing that your friend or partner or mentor or whatever did this to someone else, of course you are. I am still in the position, even doing this work, where I am friends with people that I then, or friendly colleagues, or, you know, and have a relationship with someone who is reported to us. And I go through that process every time too, and I'm a professional. And I know that it is possible, but none of us want to believe that we are capable of trusting someone like that, or that someone in our circles is capable of that. So there's a lot of work to do between the trust to this is a person who preys on other people. So first, I think it's saying, yeah, it is hard to believe. That makes sense. Because our instinct is to say, believe women, trust women, and not just women, anyone could be survivors. So believe survivors, trust survivors, which I say and I believe, and, you know, but we do sometimes have to give people that little bit of space to move from here to here, because we need that space too. When we're talking to folks who may have trouble believing, I would also ask them if people are presenting with symptoms and signs of trauma, of anxiety, of expressing hard to control emotions, of you know, if you went and looked up a trauma list and you think about this person who's reported to you, do you say, oh, a lot of these symptoms that I'm seeing match up with this person? There's a high likelihood that that person went through the trauma they're telling you they went through. So, you know, I'm a fact and data person. So that, you know, that's sort of what I would recommend someone do, is go look at the facts of what it looks like when someone presents with trauma. And those are a couple of the steps on the way, but I would also say you don't have to, and this is a hard thing, entirely necessarily let go of someone who has committed acts of sexual violence. We're not asked, because a lot of people say, you're asking us to throw this person away, you're asking us to destroy this person, to ruin this person. Doesn't this person still have value in the eyes of God and in the eyes of our spiritual community? Yes, yeah. It's complicated, and not every, you know, some survivors might be mad at me for saying that, and I get it. They've done a lot of harm. We have a lot of anger at them, and it doesn't mean they deserve to continue to have access, power, and trust from the community, but they are still a human. We're not asking you to throw them away. We're asking that if you do care about them, you want us to help prevent them from doing this again too, because it's not good for their soul that they're preying on other people either. So joining with survivors to prevent that person from harming more people, I think, is a kindness to someone who's doing that kind of harm, personally. All right, good. If you have anything to add, Stephanie, those are my 2 cents.
That's amazing. Yeah. As you were talking, one of the things that always lands for me when I'm talking to men in particular, is the question of empathy. And I have seen a lot of people try to talk to men who don't want to believe survivors, and women survivors in particular, by saying, imagine, you know, sometimes it's too much of a leap to say, imagine if this was you for some reason, but imagine if this was your wife, imagine if this was your daughter, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, there are a lot of issues with that. It's not like, I'm not saying that that's the wrong thing to do, end of story. What I am trying to say is that if we make our entire response praxis, if you will, about empathy, we're going to fall short. We don't have to empathize with people necessarily to be compassionate towards them. We don't have to have, you know, empathy is sort of like, you can put yourself in this person's place. Imagine if you were in this situation that this person is in. What I find when I'm talking to men, and I frequently talking to men who I am 99% sure that they are not perpetrators themselves, you know, like they're men who are trusted to me and whatever. And I still have like some of the closest men in my life, you know, like my spouse and my and my father and other people who I are not abusive, but who I want to understand, like it can be easier for men to immediately empathize with other men because they can imagine how horrible it would be to be falsely accused. And what I often end up saying is like, you are imagining what you would feel like if somebody said that you did this, but you are not a person who is actually capable of doing this. And so you don't actually know what it's like to be that person who is capable of doing this. And conversely, like if you're not the kind of person that that person would target, it's going to be really hard to put yourself in that person's place. And your inability to put yourself in that person's place should not be a barrier to you believing them, to you extending compassion towards them. You don't even have to like them. I mean, one of the things that we struggle with in survivor advocacy is that a lot of people get into advocacy due to empathy. And then their advocacy skills tank the first time they meet a survivor that they can't empathize with. So work on developing a practice of compassion that isn't empathy dependent. That's a big one. And we can help the people in our lives who are resistant by kind of shifting that framework for them.
You know what? And I'm going to jump back in because I love that. And, you know, I think we talk a lot about empathy, especially in faith contexts, and it is obviously still an important value. And I, you know, consider and value myself as a deeply empathetic person. And what everything Stephanie is saying is resonating deeply with me because we have several specific recent cases where, you know, churches or contexts that we have experienced generally in the past as compassionate, ethical, empathetic places have turned to us sure that they have the one case where a survivor is lying. And in all those cases, what we have found is that no, the survivor just was really not what a lot of people would refer to as a cultural fit for that space. And so people did not like the person who was reporting the violence, and maybe they did like the person who was reported as having been violent. And so they were convinced that this was a case where someone was lying, when it was just a case where they did not like the survivors and so could not practice what Stephanie was talking about, that compassion and what I like to talk about, that checking of the facts. Wow, this person really was presenting with a lot of signs of trauma, which makes it likely that they're telling the truth. But instead they're reading those signs of trauma as signs of being annoying or erratic or lying. And so what it is
crazy. Survivors are constantly being labeled as crazy.
Yeah, crazy, right? Yeah, because there is a zone that our culture likes to try to put survivors in of like, you need to be sad, but not too sad. You can be a little bit angry, but in a controlled way. You know, you have to report with enough emotion that we believe you, but not so much that it goes over the top. So all those kind of rules that we put on survivors. But yeah, I really love that framing. I don't think I've ever heard Stephanie say it quite like that before, of compassion. And we don't have to like someone, and we don't have to find their story to be something we empathize with, or how we would have behaved in a situation, or how we would have perceived a situation and therefore acted. We just have to be compassionate, pay attention to the facts, you know, and turn to an expert. We always say turn to an expert for help.
I think that's great, and it does lead into the next thing that I think we should talk about. And this is kind of opposite of the non-believers. what do we do with those who are socially aware of these types of things, and might have either suspected abuse of a friend or a family member, either by the words of that friend or family member or simply by observation? I think we've all been in situations where we feel that feeling of, ooh, I don't like how they're being treated. I don't agree with how, do I say something? Do I not say something? Do I butt out? Is it going to make it worse? Do we go back and talk to the person after? I think, what do you guys suggest that we should do? How do we handle that in such a way that it shows our support? And if they want to share something, we're there to listen and we're going to believe them.
Yeah.
So I'm someone who's always going to say, or I want to really strongly say this before I give any caveats. Yes, I think almost always the answer is yes. Speak up, intervene, reach out in some way. And I'm going to give caveats, but I say that first because there is a strong, there are strong cultural threads from all sides that say, no, be cautious about it. So I want to push through that, no, be cautious about it, and just tear that down for a minute and say, yes, it's a good idea. Because some of those threads are, respectability. Oh, we don't intervene in other people's lives. Another thread comes from advocacy backgrounds, and it's, you might put someone in more danger if you intervene. And that's a message we hear a lot. And another cultural thread might be, what's the risk to me, if I do this, or what's the risk if I do this and got it wrong, and then I've really messed up, multiple people's lives maybe. So there are all these, we're going to feel all these cautions. And so that's why I first say, yes, intervene, reach out, do something. Because I want to speak a little bit to those, in particular, the one that says you're going to put someone in more danger if you speak up. That is, it is a myth. It is a myth. If someone is consistently violent towards someone, they will be consistently violent towards that person, whether you intervene, whether you don't intervene. And in fact, intervening is more likely to have impact than not intervening, is more likely to have positive impact than negative impact. In particular, because I don't know that we've talked about it today, but we've talked about before how people who target folks test boundaries and they test for supportive people around someone. So someone who targets folks is looking to see if that person has boundaries, and also if someone else will stop them if they abuse that person in front of them, because they don't want to get caught. They're motivated by being able to continue doing what they're doing. And so if they find that they are targeting someone and someone else steps in, that's a signal to them that this is someone who is too difficult to target, too much work, too dangerous, too possible to get them caught. So yes, we do recommend intervening, and we don't buy into that old mythology that, oh, you're putting them in more danger. We don't think that's the case. Now, caveats, there are things to consider. In some cases, you want to intervene right there, and I would say definitely yes, do it. In some cases, if it's a friend in a relationship and you have this like long ongoing context, that might be one where I would try to talk to someone privately first and see what's going on, especially if it's something that's like developed over time. Are you two in a rough patch? Is this always how this person is talking to you? Are you noticing that this isn't okay? I want to help you see that this isn't okay. I'm going to give you a heads up. Now, I'm not going to be able to watch this person talk to you like this. And I am going to intervene. You might, if you have that ongoing relationship, you might want to choose to approach it that way instead of just intervening in front of folks. However, most of the time I will say, Just as an example, I always intervene. Stephanie has been on the phone with me when I intervene with strangers. Like, I always intervene, and whatever we imagine, whatever scary thing we imagine is going to happen to us if we do that, it's never happened to me. People might yell at me, but nothing intensely dangerous has ever happened. So my example would be, I was in the airport. We were trying to get to an into account retreat, and all of us were at different airports with blizzards and flights canceled. So we're all on the phone together trying to figure out, are we going home? Are we trying again? Are we rescheduling? And I'm typing away on my computer looking for flights. I'm talking to these folks, and I see a father abusing his son in front of me. And it's the kind of space where it's all very silent, except for what's happening. And there are lots of people looking, right? And there's that impact of, you've probably been in the situation where all the bystanders are looking at each other going, are we just going to let this happen, right? There's kind of a silent conversation that happens of, we're all uncomfortable with this, right? And then everyone looks right back down at what they were doing. And so I say, it's going to be me. It always has to be me. So here we go. It's going to be me again. And they start to walk away. So I collect up all my things and I get in step with them. And I say, we do not talk to children like that. We do not put our hands on children. This is not okay. And I know I'm not going to stop this guy from being an abusive guy. I'm doing this for the child, right? The child needs to have an adult in their life hear someone say, what just happened to you wasn't okay. Because when we all stand there and watch it happen, we're telling the child it's okay. And that's something I've committed to myself, that I'm not okay with ever being lumped into, yeah, we're all okay with this. We're not going to say anything. So, so I'm following him. And of course he starts calling me all sorts of fun words. And I just turn away from him and look at the child and say, it's not okay for a grown-up to ever put hands on you. It's not okay for someone to talk to you the way your dad is talking to you. Like, you deserve love and care. And they're walking away and he's shouting at me. But that little boy's eyes were like it just looked like no one had ever spoken back to his father like that in front of him. He just looked awestruck that anyone had talked to his dad like that. And I did not change. I probably did not change his life forever or that circumstance that he's in, but I hope that I planted a seed in his head, that was enough for him to say, there are at least some people who think what's happening to me is not okay. And that hopefully, he'll be able to take steps sooner. So I say, stranger, friend, anyone, always intervene, because especially when we're in long-term abusive situations, we start to lose faith that it can ever change. And we start to forget that it's even undeserved, and we start to think we deserve it. And so any disruption that we can give, that's, I see this, I don't think it's okay, I think it's positive. And I'll leave it there and let Stephanie weigh in if she has additional thoughts.
Yeah, see, I choose my colleagues well. I want to pick up on the thread of children specifically. And because one of the first things when you're deciding, okay, am I going to intervene? How am I going to intervene? One of the first questions that you're dealing with is, what is the age of the person we're talking about? If it's a child, and when I say a child, I include teenagers. I think we do not do nearly enough to protect teenagers, and I can get on a real high horse about that, especially with the recent case that brought us all together with David Haas. But children are so frequently subjected to pressures that are developmentally inappropriate for them. And we don't, I feel like one of the basic pieces of information that all adults need to have, and you don't have to be a parent. I'm not a parent, but I'm passionately invested in these things. You need to know what is age appropriate for kids, what they can understand. And so just to speak specifically about teenagers and about like that, the particular vulnerabilities that are in that transition from childhood to adulthood, perpetrators are very cognizant of those vulnerabilities. And, you know, what I see often in church settings, there's we get a lot of reports of youth pastor teenager abuse, youth pastors abusing teenagers, and particularly if the teenagers are young women or girl. Let's stick with girls, because I want people to understand, like, young women who are 17, 18, 19 are still children in a lot of ways. But we expect adult level maturity from girls. We're like, oh, well, girls are always more mature than boys. Girls, you know, girls should be able to handle themselves. That's what we expect of them. No, intervene when you see an adult man being, interacting with a teenage girl in a way that you're like, that feels a little off, but I don't see anything really happening yet. So, okay, intervene. Just like, I cannot tell you how many stories, again, to talk about the David Haas case, I've heard lots of stories of like things that happened after concerts, things that happened on the last day of Music Ministry Alive. You know, one example I can give is he was notorious for like hugging and kissing all the time, lots of hugging and kissing, especially the girls. Like you just have to put up with that. That's just David, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I got one report from a young woman who, you know, she had experienced some really gross stuff, like him asking her if she'd had sex with her boyfriend and stuff like that. Like the kinds of questions, if another adult heard them and they didn't intervene, I'd be like, what's your problem? Like, step in now. On the last day of Music Ministry Alive, she was standing next to her mother, and he walked over to her, and then she was like, this is my mother. And she said immediately his interest was gone. He just walked away. He was just like, oh, okay, there's a mom in the loop and mom's standing right here. So you know, people, teenagers who are targeted by perpetrators, it's not infrequent that they've already experienced abuse in their primary family context, and they are someone who has had to grow up quickly and presents as very mature. That's a common scenario. And when that scenario presents itself and a perpetrator is like, well, everyone says she's mature anyway, like this is a case where I can probably target this person, and then everybody will be like, well, you know, I mean, she could take care of herself, that one. No, they can't. They're children. They're children. So yeah, I'm just putting in a big plug for intervention with that particular age group. They can look like adults, they can know how to talk like adults, they are not adults. And even when they're young adults, they are still learning to be adults, and developmentally, they're not quite there yet. You don't have to condescend to them to protect them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stephanie, Jay, thank you so much. You know, so certainly intervention is key. In addition to intervention, what is some of the best ways or best practices for us as individuals to truly support survivors? And by that same token, what should we be aware of with all of our good intentions? What should we avoid?
Well, I think I would just briefly want to set the stage with the first thing is be willing to be uncomfortable, and to realize that sexual violence And you know, any form of abuse, particularly that involves gaslighting and trying to convince somebody that their reality is not what they think it is. Those are profoundly destabilizing experiences. And in order to really be there for that survivor, you are also going to feel destabilized. What we find with people who really are well-intentioned, but kind of think this is a problem, like, well, you know, we've got such a good thing going here in our church or in our, you know, our particular professional association or what have you. We've just got this little problem with abuse. And it could just be, you know, I'm an American Studies and gender scholar, so I'm always looking at systems. And systems, when a system is producing lots of abusers, it's a sign that the system itself needs intervention. So when you're hearing somebody talk about their experience, look for the systemic components. Like, okay, what do we actually have any practices in place for challenging the authority of charismatic celebrity type individuals within our organization or within our context? You know, do we have a culture of, we just want to get past this? What can you, like, I've literally had survivors who have heard, like, what do we need to do to make this go away? And I think of it as like the whole thing of like, we really want to help you. We really want to help you so that we can go on with the cool stuff that we do. That becomes the primary impediment. Abuse is so central in our culture right now that I think like the way that we get through it is by being like, okay, we're going to commit to being super uncomfortable. We are going to stop telling survivors that they're taking up too much space, that they're draining too much energy from us. Another thing that is really helpful is the way that we process our own trauma in relation to survivors. We talk a lot at Into Account about trauma comparisons and trauma reenactment. When you are caught up in trauma reenactment, you go into every situation looking for the victim, the villain, and the hero. And so that immediately sets up a situation where victims are competing with each other. Who was the most victimized? And what we find inevitably is that people start feeling victimized by survivors because they had a good thing going, you know, possibly like they were comfortable with how things are. A survivor came along and disrupted it. They thought they responded effectively to the survivor. And then the survivor keeps coming back and saying, no, you didn't. And the defensive sort of like, you've taken up enough space now, go deal with yourself. That defensiveness is what keeps the abuse cycles going. So, you know, sort of the takeaway from that, I would say is you have to stop thinking about survivors as a drain on resources. You can be, you know, if you have your own trauma, it is important to take it seriously. Like you don't need to engage in trauma comparisons. You don't need to compete for who's the most traumatized. We have enough compassion to go around. If we tell ourselves, we have enough, I mean, in the church, if you think that your you know, your core virtue is love and compassion, why would you not assume that there's enough to go around? Rather than telling survivors, you've taken up enough space, you've taken up enough time, you are not healing the way we think you should. If you're having lots of conversations where you're telling survivors that they need to get over it or that they're just not doing the right thing that you think they should be doing, if you're having a lot of those kinds of conversations, you have a problem and your system has a problem. So you've really got to commit to, and also don't mistake being uncomfortable for trauma. They're not the same thing. You know, we're talking about the music people needing to give up music that they love. That's part of what has brought us all together. And you need to be allowed to grieve that. Grief is important. But it's not the same thing as being traumatized. So honor your own emotions, and also don't pit them against survivors. Just make room for them and commit to making room with them for the rest of your life. Jay, you want to add anything?
Sure, yeah. Some other things I think, I'm just going to share some things that we've learned to look for, because I don't think folks really know what to look for, right? Because we see people being able to sort of get this kind of access repeatedly, which means we don't know the signs to look for. So here are some things we've learned. We've learned that when you hear something like, oh, this guy, he's just kind of a womanizer, I mean, he just cheats a lot on his partner. Maybe not always, but a lot of times we've learned that probably means there's some sort of sexual violence or predation going on, because it's going to require a lot of deception. So it's already someone who's comfortable with a lot of deception, who doesn't have a commitment to maintaining like truthful, honest, direct relationships. And so most likely, if someone just cheats a lot, there's something more going on there than just, oops, he could be better at marriage. Usually there's some sort of other sexual violence going on underneath the covers of that. So it's smart to listen for, oh, that guy's just a womanizer. Oh, that guy just has a lot of these relationships. That's usually not the end of it. Something also we've hit a little bit today is that we've noticed that folks who repeatedly target people have that trifecta of access, power over, and the good regard and trust of the community. So obviously there are plenty of people who have power and access and trust who are not abusing it. However, because that's what allows people to get away with it for longer, we notice that people who target folks seek out roles that will give them those things. So it just means we have to pay extra attention to anyone who has a lot of power and authority and trust, and that we are paying deep attention to whether or not they are abusing those things. And if someone is abusing their power to get kickbacks, or abusing their power to take advantage of other folks in some ways, we need to watch and pay attention to that, because that means that may carry over to other behaviors too. They may then be taking advantage of people who they have power over. They may be predators who are preying on people they have power over. So it also means that when we hear, when we start to hear these repeated stories of, there's something I didn't like about the way this happened, I just felt uncomfortable when this happened, when we hear those little signal words that maybe if it was just one story we could dismiss, those little signal words tell us there is a pattern going on that's deeper than we think it is, and we need to dig into it. And that's where discomfort that Stephanie was talking about becomes really important, because it's not comfortable to say to someone directly, like, I've heard several stories about you making people uncomfortable, and I'd like to talk to you about them. But we just have to. We have to. And from my experience, because I'm someone who does this all the time, the way someone responds to you is going to tell you a lot about whether your suspicions are true. And now I'm afraid I'm teaching people to respond a different way, but because generally what I see is, if you say to someone who has no ill intent something like, hey, I saw a long hug with Jessica after church or after that concert or whatever. It made me feel pretty uncomfortable. If you're talking to someone with good ethics and integrity, you're going to hear something like, yeah, you know, it made me a little uncomfortable too. Or you're going to hear something like, oh, tell me more about that. You know, why did that seem uncomfortable to you? Oh, you know, something receptive, or possibly, oh my gosh, really? It made you feel uncomfortable? Like, tell me more. I don't want to be doing something like that. Like, those are all some reasonable responses to give. What you're going to hear from someone who is likely crossing boundaries is something more like, how dare you? You know, that's disgusting that you would say that I would do something like that with Jessica, and like, you better not say this to anyone else. Or, you know, like, what is wrong with you that you would think? Like, it's angry, it's defensive, it's disbelieving, it's somehow trying to put it on you, that you're the gross person for having thought something like that when looking at it. It's all deflection, defense, anger, you know, no receptiveness, no openness to hearing, you know, why that maybe wasn't appropriate. And that's a big sign. And that's the thing that, you know, we're afraid of happening, is some big confrontation. And I'm going to say, yeah, it probably will. If there's someone who is crossing boundaries, if it is someone who's crossing boundaries, it probably will be. See, my dog agrees. If someone's crossing boundaries, they're going to be defensive. They're going to be angry, and they're going to want to shut it down, shame you out of talking about it again. You know, they're going to come at you so hard that they hope you never question them again. And that's how you know you're on the right track, unfortunately. But we have to have those uncomfortable conversations, because we can nip things in the bud if we're willing to get uncomfortable and talk to folks early in the process.
Yeah, we want to make it intolerable to be abusive. Just like, oh, all the things that stop perpetrators from being able to get any further, we want to ubiquitously be doing those things. I don't know what makes people change, but it's not being enabled. It's not people being like, there's nothing we can do about it, so we're just not going to try. That's the cultural climate that perpetrators exploit.
Yeah, exactly. And you haven't done any harm to someone who's not doing anything wrong by asking them about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I work with youth locally, I do some volunteer work at a local nonprofit. If someone came to me and said, I saw XYZ and it didn't feel right to me, I would not feel harmed by that. You would not have ruined my career. You would not have ruined my volunteer position. You would not, you know, because that's our fears. Is one of our fears maybe, is that we're going to falsely accuse someone and it's going to ruin and destroy them. No, asking me, you know, about an interaction has not harmed me in any way, and has either given me an opportunity to learn, explain, or share my shared discomfort about that youth's boundaries, and opened up a conversation so I can say, yes, that youth is always wanting to hug me. Can we talk about what's happening in their home, and are they okay in other ways? Right? So, like, no harm, no foul if you have talked to someone who actually is trying their best to have good boundaries and doesn't have any ill intention. You know, unless, I guess, maybe if you went straight to Facebook and said, I saw Jay Yoder hugging someone and I didn't like it, okay, that could get uncomfortable, maybe not a great approach. But if you've just opened the conversation, if you've intervened and, you know, done some of that, like, first initial checking of how do you respond when I ask you about my discomfort, you're not hurting anyone. And you know, that's, I think, our fear. So let's let go of that fear it's okay to ask people about what's going on. And if you get that defensive response, that's when you want to pull someone else in right away, so it doesn't get into a one-on-one individual battle. You know, if you would come to me and say, I have this concern, and I say, how dare you, it's you who's sick, you know, and then I'm to protect myself gonna go tell all my friends, oh, this Stephanie Crable thinks I'm a bad person. Stephanie's crazy. Don't listen to anything she says. That's when, you know, Stephanie is going to go get some backup and say like, hey, here's what I saw. You know, here's what we need to be talking about. But those are sort of some of the initial things. And again, anytime you feel like you're in over your head, that's why places like Into Account exist, or Grace, or Faith Trust, or you know, we can make some different recommendations. But that's why places like us exist, because we have done this so many times that Stephanie, Hillary, and I have sort of each correctly and accurately predicted the meltdown of a predator before, because we've seen it so many times. We know exactly what they're going to do, move by move, play by play. So come to us with anything, and we will help you think through how to like go about sort of starting to prevent the access, the power, maybe remove some of that good regard and trust. Okay, but I'll leave it there.
I think that's so wonderful, just to share with us and empower us to feel like we can be somebody's advocate, or at least in the moment, to be an advocate and find somebody else that's stronger. One of the things that we talked about briefly in the first session of this series was recognizing somebody's body language. And if one person approaches somebody to hug them, that may not be a comfortable situation for the one being hugged. Normally, if you see somebody hugging, you see them hugging each other. So, you know, approaching each other with open arms shows a more positive relationship, I think, most of the time, or watching their body language to how they're responding to the hug, and to have that ability to go up to them and say, hey, I noticed that you weren't very receptive to that. You know, is there anything going on? So I think sometimes it's just about public awareness on our part. And then again, not being afraid to ask about it, not being afraid to let them know somebody's there that wants to listen to them. Again, this has been so incredibly helpful for us and enlightening for the NPM team. I'm hoping that anybody who is watching these sessions is feeling empowered to advocate for someone, or feeling strongly that they can go to someone else if they've experienced any kind of abuse. I know that Jay and Stephanie and the entire Into Account team is obviously, they're strong advocates, and additionally, they are passionate about their work. I can see it, I can hear it. I think that everyone can feel that. So we just want to remind you that should you feel the need to have support from Into Account, please contact them. Stephanie, could you just share the contact information? I know we're going to put it at the end of this presentation, but just one more time.
Yeah, sure. Our website is intoaccount.org. And when you go to the website, there are immediately links that you can follow to contact us. So that's the easiest way to do it.
Great. Additionally, don't forget that they are a nonprofit. And if you'd like to support their work, donate, donate, donate. Go to that website, same website, and make a donation, not only for the Into Account nonprofit, but also to show your support for all of these victims of abuse. Again, we're so thankful that you're here, that you were willing to come and speak with us. We can't thank you enough. Jennifer, anything that you want to say to round this up?
I want to express my thanks as well. These are difficult but important conversations to have, and I think we can really make an impact and change the future of our industry together. So thank you again on behalf of all of NPM members.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, thank you so much.